Welcome to this simple tutorial where we build movement for 2D games like platformers and other games like that. To start our 2D movement, we're going to need a player. So we can right click on our hierarchy, create a 2D object, a sprite, and then a square. We can name the square player, and then we're going to add some components to this. We can add a box collider 2D component to our player, and we can also add a rigid body 2D component to our player. In this rigid body 2D, we're going to need to freeze the rotation on the z-axis so our player doesn't spin around whenever he hits a ledge or he is hit by a projectile. We're also going to change this interpolate to interpolate and collision detection from discrete to continuous. This makes sure our player does not phase through any walls or anything like that. So now we're going to also need the ground. So we can right click on our hierarchy, create a 2D object, a sprite, and then a square. We can name this square ground. We can move this square to the bottom of the screen. We can scale it on the x-axis to make it much bigger. We can maybe change the color to something like green. And then we're also going to need to add a box collider 2D to this game object right here. We're not going to need to change any of this right here because this is just going to stay stable. Now we're going to need to create a script for this player so that he can jump around on this little box. So we can create a C# script inside of our assets folder. We can name this C# script player movement. And then once this C# script has been made, we can open it up in our code editor. Now we can open up our player movement script inside of our coding editor like VS Code or Visual Studio. Now once we're in our coding editor, we can delete the start method because we're not going to need it right now. And then we're going to add a few variables. So first we're going to create a public rigid body 2D. We can name this rigid body 2D because it is our rigid body 2D. And then we are also going to need to create variables for the speed and jump height of our player. So we can create a public float. We can name this speed. We can set this to something like 10. We can create a public float. We can name this jump height. We can set this to something like 5. And then inside of update, we're going to check if we're moving and then set it to our rigid body. So we can create a new float. We can name this x movement. We can set this equal to input.getAxisRaw. And then inside the parentheses, it's going to look for a string reference. So we can type horizontal. And this is just our movement on the x-axis for the arrow keys. We can now go to our rigid body 2D. Once we get to here, we can type dot velocity. We can set this equal to a new vector 2. And then inside this vector 2, we are going to want to have our x movement as the x-axis on the x-axis times our speed. And then we can do our rigid body 2D dot velocity dot y on the y-axis because we won't want to change our velocity on the y-axis just if we're moving left and right. So now we're going to have the jump. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an if statement, and we're going to check if input dot get key down, and then inside the parentheses we can type key code dot whatever key you want to have. I'm going to put space right here just as my jump key, but you can have whatever you want. And now we're also going to need to check that if we're grounded or not. So up the top we're going to need to create a few more variables to check if we're grounded. We're going to create a public boolean, and we can name this is grounded. This is going to be set. This is going to be if our player is grounded or not. We're going to create a public game object, and we can name this ground check circle. And then this will be the position of the ground check at the bottom of the player's feet, so that whenever this is touching the ground, we will know that the player is touching the ground. We're also going to need a public layer mask, and this is just a layer, so we're going to type in here ground layer That's what this can be called, and this is just so that we know that we're touching the ground and not anything else. So now, if we're touching the space key or whatever key you want, we can do and is grounded is set to true. We can do that by just typing is grounded. And now we're going to need to set is grounded up at the top of update. So we can set is grounded. We can set this equal to physics. We can set this equal to physics 2D dot overlap circle. And it's going to look for a few parameters. We can, for the first one, we can put the ground check circle dot transform dot position. For the second one, we can put 0.1f. And then for the third one, we can put our ground layer. What these do is the first one is the position of this overlap circle. The second one is the radius of this circle. Just we can put a 0.1 there just to make it that we really are touching the ground. And this is just the ground layer, just so we know that if we are touching the actual ground. So now if we touch the ground and we're touching space, we can jump. So what we'll do is we will get our rigid body 2D dot velocity. We'll set this equal to a new vector 2. And then on the x-axis, we'll just get our rigid body 2D dot velocity dot x. And then on the y-axis, we will need to set our velocity to our jump height so that we will jump at the right jump height. So once we have all of this typed in, we can go back into our Unity editor, and then once this is finally loaded up, we'll be able to put our script onto our player, and then our player will be able to move around the screen. Now once we get back into our Unity editor, we can go to our player, and we can add this player movement component to it. It's going to look for a few things like our rigid body 2D. It's going to look for the ground check circle. We can create that right now. So on the player, we're going to right click, we're going to create, when we right click, we're going to create empty. We can name this ground check circle. We can click W and position this at the bottom of the player. On the player, we can drag this ground check circle into here. And the ground layer, we're going to have to go to our ground. And then we're going to go to our layer. And then right here on this drop down, we're going to click add a layer. And then in user layer 6, we can just add ground. We can go back to the ground, add the ground layer to the ground game object. And then inside of the player, in this player movement script, for this ground layer, we can click on this drop down, the ground. So if we save up our script, we can click play and see if this is all working. Once we're in play mode, we can see that our player has fallen to the ground. We can use the arrow keys and we can jump. And then if you don't like this movement in particular, you can go to the player game object, go down to the bottom and change this speed and jump height. Maybe I can change the jump height to 10 and change the speed to something like 8. And then you can also change the gravity scale. So if I change the gravity scale to 3 and set the jump height to 15, now the player will go down faster, but he will also be able to jump higher because we changed the gravity scale. So now I think this looks very nice for a platformer game. You move kind of slowly, but you also jump very high, so you'll be able to get over obstacles and maybe enemies. Thank you for following along through this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please give our channel a like and a subscribe because it really helps out our channel. Thank you.